The dawn of February 10, 1306, broke cold and still over the town of Dumfries in southwestern Scotland. Inside the stone walls of the Greyfriars Church, two men stood before the altar where countless Scots had taken communion, where marriages had been blessed, where the dead had been consecrated for burial. The church was sanctuary, a sacred space where violence was forbidden by both the laws of God and the laws of men. But on this morning, those laws would be shattered by an act that would echo through the centuries. Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick and claimant to the Scottish throne, had arranged to meet his rival John Comyn, known as the Red Comyn, to discuss matters that concerned them both. The meeting had been arranged under the guise of peace, a negotiation between two men who both believed they should rule Scotland. What words passed between them in those final moments before violence erupted? No chronicle records with certainty. Some say Bruce accused Comyn of betraying him to the English king. Others claim the argument erupted over who had the stronger claim to the crown. What is certain is that steel was drawn before the altar itself. Bruce struck first, his dagger finding flesh. Comyn fell, bleeding onto the stone floor where priests had stood to elevate the host. Bruce's companions rushed forward, Roger de Kirkpatrick among them, and according to the chronicler Walter of Guisborough, they dragged the dying man from the vestry and finished him on the steps of the high altar itself. Blood pooled on sacred stone. The sanctuary had been violated. A man had been murdered in the house of God. The news spread across Scotland like wildfire in dry heather. To the English King Edward I, it was confirmation that Bruce was a traitor and a savage. To the Scottish people, divided in their loyalties, it was either an act of necessary violence or unforgivable sacrilege. But most significantly, to Pope Clement V in distant Avignon, it was a crime that could not go unpunished. Within weeks, the papal bull arrived. Robert Bruce was excommunicated, cast out from the church, denied the sacraments, his very soul imperiled. But Bruce did not retreat into penance. 6 weeks after murdering Comyn, he had himself crowned King of Scots at Scone Abbey on March 25, 1306. The Bishop of Glasgow, Robert Wishart, granted him absolution for the murder and placed the crown on his head. It was a coronation conducted in defiance of both the English king and the Pope himself. Bruce would rule Scotland as an outlaw in the eyes of both secular and spiritual authority. And here was the paradox that would shape everything that followed. Scotland now had a king who was excommunicated, a kingdom whose monarch existed outside the authority of the Church. When Pope Clement V issued the papal bulls in 1312, ordering the suppression of the Knights Templar and the transfer of their properties to the Knights Hospitaller, those orders would reach every corner of Christendom, every corner, that is, except the one place where the king owed no obedience to Rome. In Scotland, the Pope's writ meant nothing. Robert Bruce answered to no one. This was the opening act of a mystery that historians would puzzle over for 7 centuries. What happened to the Knights Templar in Scotland? Where did their properties go? Who claimed their wealth? And why, when papal bulls demanded their immediate transfer to the Hospitallers, did those transfers never fully occur? The answer begins not in 1312, but in that moment of violence on a February morning in a church in Dumfries, when a man struck down his rival before God's altar and set Scotland on a course that would place it beyond the reach of papal authority at the precise moment when that authority would matter most. To understand what transpired in Scotland in 1312, we must first comprehend what the Knights Templar had become and the magnitude of the crisis that engulfed them. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar, had been founded in Jerusalem around 1119 with a stated mission to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. By the early 14th century, they had evolved into something unprecedented in medieval history, a transnational military-religious corporation that answered only to the Pope and wielded financial power rivaling most kingdoms. In Scotland, the Templar presence dated to 1128 when Hugh de Payens, the order's first Grand Master, met with King David I and was granted lands for a preceptory. The principal Scottish seat of the order was established at Ballintrodoch in Midlothian, a name derived from the Gaelic Baile nan Trodoch, meaning town of the warriors. By 1296, the Templars held considerable possessions throughout Scotland, from Nairnshire in the north to the borders in the south. They administered estates, collected rents and tithes, served the royal household with almonry duties, and recruited knights for crusading efforts. Historical records indicate that by the time of the Suppression in 1312, Templar assets in Scotland exceeded those of their rival order, the Knights Hospitaller, by approximately 50%. The relationship between the Scottish Templars and the nobility was symbiotic. Aristocrats donated properties in exchange for spiritual benefits and legal protections. In about 1187, William the Lion granted part of the Coulter lands on the south bank of the River Dee to the order. Between 1221 and 1236, Walter Bisset of Aboyne founded the preceptory at Mary Coulter. Alan Fitzwalter, the second Lord High Steward of Scotland, was a benefactor. The Templars were woven into the fabric of Scottish society, their white mantles with red crosses a familiar sight in royal courts and on battlefields. Then came October 13th, 1307. On that Friday, King Philip IV of France orchestrated one of the most audacious operations in medieval history. At dawn, royal officers across France simultaneously arrested approximately 15,000 Templars, knights, sergeants, chaplains, and servants. The charges were calculated to invoke maximum horror: denying Christ, spitting on the cross during initiation ceremonies, worshipping an idol called Baphomet, engaging in sodomy, conducting secret rituals. Under torture, many knights confessed to these crimes. The methods employed were those standard to medieval interrogation: the rack, the strappado, burning the soles of feet, near drowning. Pope Clement V initially protested the arrests as violations of papal authority over religious orders. But Philip possessed leverage. He had engineered Clement's election and effectively moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon, within French territory. Within weeks, Clement capitulated. His bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae of November 22, 1307, ordered all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars and seize their assets. The pattern of state capture of religious authority was established, yet enforcement varied dramatically by jurisdiction. In Portugal, King Denis conducted his own investigation and declared the Templars innocent, later reconstituting them as the Order of Christ. In Aragon, James II refused to torture prisoners and found no evidence of heresy. In England, Edward II initially delayed, and when arrests finally occurred, trials concluded with minimal convictions. Across Germany and Cyprus, similar patterns emerged. Templars were examined, confessions were not forthcoming, and the charges appeared manufactured. Only in France, where prisoners were tortured by royal officers before being handed to church inquisitors, did the charges stick. The correlation between torture and confession was absolute. Brothers who were not tortured did not confess. Those who were tortured confessed to whatever their interrogators suggested. Modern historians recognize these inconsistencies as evidence that the charges were fabricated, the confessions coerced, and the entire proceedings a judicial murder orchestrated for political and financial gain. On March 22, 1312, Pope Clement V issued the papal bull Vox in excelso at the Council of Vienne, formally dissolving the Knights Templar. 2 months later, on May 2, the bull ad providam directed the transfer of all Templar properties to the Knights Hospitaller. According to the official historical narrative, this transfer should have proceeded smoothly across Christendom. Former Templar preceptories, estates, and assets were to be conveyed to Hospitaller administration, adding significantly to their holdings. But in Scotland, something entirely different occurred. Or rather, something did not occur. The transfer that should have been immediate, that was documented in meticulous detail in England and across continental Europe, left barely a trace in Scottish records. The properties that should have been inventoried, assessed, and handed over to the Hospitallers at Torfachen simply vanished from the documentary evidence. Individual Templars who should have been arrested, tried, or pensioned off disappeared from official records without arrests, without trials, without executions. They simply ceased to be Templars in name, while remaining present in fact. A transformation documented not in royal chronicles, but in silences that speak louder than words. For centuries, the fate of the Scottish Templars remained a historical footnote, overshadowed by the dramatic persecutions in France and the elaborate trials in England. Then, beginning in the late 20th century, a series of discoveries began to illuminate what had been hidden in plain sight for 700 years. The breakthrough came not from a single dramatic find, but from the patient accumulation of evidence drawn from archaeology, archival research, and forensic analysis of the gaps in the historical record. In 2016, during routine maintenance of a churchyard wall at Temple in Midlothian, the village that bears its name from the Templar preceptory of Ballintrodoch. Construction workers uncovered 2 carved stone slabs buried in the foundations. The discovery triggered immediate archaeological response. The stones displayed characteristics consistent with 12th or 13th century funerary monuments. Their incorporation into a later wall suggested they had been repurposed, removed from their original context. Their inscriptions and symbolism deemed either irrelevant or too sensitive to remain visible. Archaeological teams from Edinburgh documented the stone's dimensions, carving techniques, and iconographic elements before removing them for conservation and analysis. The discovery was not isolated. In 2020, researchers conclusively identified 2 church bells in Dumfriesshire that had hung in their tower for 900 years as having been sponsored by a 12th century knight. The identification came after investigation involving international specialists in paleography, ecclesiastical history, and bell history. Victorian-era interpretation had obscured the bells' origins, attributing them to later periods and misreading the Latin inscriptions cast into their bronze surfaces. Modern imaging techniques combined with comparative analysis of bell-founding practices in medieval Scotland and France revealed that the bells had originally hung over a convent at Sacro Namur, Holy Wood, an establishment with documented connections to the early Templar presence in southwestern Scotland. At Kilmartin in Argyll, another layer of evidence revealed itself through carved grave slabs preserved in the parish church and its adjacent graveyard. The collection includes early Christian and medieval stones dating from approximately 1300 onward, a period precisely coinciding with the Templar suppression. Among these monuments are several displaying no names, no heraldic devices, no family affiliations, only the incised impression of a life-sized straight sword. This stark anonymity stands in sharp contrast to typical medieval funerary practices, where identity, lineage, and achievements were proclaimed in stone for eternity. Archaeological analysis of the carving techniques suggests they were created by skilled masons familiar with military iconography. The swords themselves are depicted with specific details, crossguards, pommels, blade shapes, that correspond to weapons used by military orders in the early 14th century. One slab displays a sword with a scallop shell-shaped pommel, a symbol associated with pilgrimage and the crusading orders, particularly the Templars who had fought in the Holy Land. Carbon dating and stratigraphic analysis of burial sites associated with these stones indicate interments occurring in the decades immediately following 1307. Excavations conducted under license from Historic Environment Scotland revealed burial orientations and grave goods suggesting military individuals of significant status. Yet none appear in the documentary record. No wills, no charters of land transfer, no entries in burgh records. They were buried with honor, but without official recognition. Ghosts in the historical record, their identities erased or concealed. Modern archaeological science has provided tools to interrogate these silences. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at former Templar preceptories have revealed building foundations that do not match later architectural phases, suggesting construction episodes that went unrecorded. Radiocarbon dating of timbers and organic materials from these structures consistently returns dates in the early 14th century, precisely when the order was officially extinct. At Temple in Midlothian, surveys revealed building foundations beneath and around the existing church that predate the documented hospitaller occupation, but postdate the original Templar preceptory. The architectural layouts match design principles documented at Templar commanderies in France and the Holy Land, including specific orientations, proportional relationships between structures, and defensive features characteristic of military religious architecture. These were not local builders copying generic monastic layouts, but professionals applying specialized knowledge of Templar architectural tradition. The only plausible explanation is that Templar personnel or their direct apprentices were involved in the construction decades after the order was officially extinct. Perhaps most telling was the discovery of systematic gaps in documentary sources. Archival research in France, England, and Scotland has uncovered absences in the historical record, missing folios in monastic cartularies, pages cut from royal registers, entire sequences of dates in which no official business appears to have been transacted. At several Scottish abbeys with known Templar connections, including Melrose and Holyrood, Folios covering the years 1307-1320 are missing. The pages were not lost to age or decay. They were cut from the bindings with deliberate precision. In some cases, stub edges remain visible, showing where parchment was removed. These gaps correspond exactly to the period when Templar refugees would have been most active in Scotland. Reconstructing the timeline of Templar presence in Scotland requires assembling fragments from sources that were never meant to be connected. The process begins with what is definitively known and builds outward, using archaeology and comparative analysis to fill the silences in the written record. What emerges is a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of properties changing hands. The papal bull Ad Providam of May 2, 1312, explicitly ordered the transfer of Templar properties to the Knights Hospitaller. In England, this transfer was documented extensively. Inventories were compiled listing every Templar holding, manors, mills, churches, rents, and movable goods. The process was litigious and protracted, with disputes over individual properties extending for decades. A report compiled in 1338 by Philip de Thom, prior of the hospital in England, provided a comprehensive inventory of all hospitaller lands, including those formerly held by the Templars. The transfer was still incomplete 26 years after the papal decree, but it was meticulously recorded at every stage. In Scotland, no comparable inventories survive from 1312. The absence is striking. The only detailed records that exist are those made by the Hospitallers themselves at later dates, when they rented out most of the former Templar lands after the orders were dissolved. But these later documents reveal significant anomalies. Properties that should have been transferred in 1312 do not appear in Hospitaller rental accounts until decades later. Some never appear at all, instead passing directly into royal hands or noble estates through mechanisms that bypass ecclesiastical authority entirely. The official narrative holds that following the papal bull, Templar properties at sites like Ballantradock and Mary Coulter were conveyed to the Hospitallers, who administered them from their Scottish headquarters at Torfaen Preceptory, near Linlithgow. But the timing of these transfers is contradicted by multiple sources. One account states that the Knights Hospitaller left Scotland after the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, only returning later after a reconciliation with Robert the Bruce. If the Hospitallers were absent from Scotland for years after the supposed transfer, who was administering the former Templar estates? Place name evidence provides crucial insight. Throughout Scotland, locations continued to be called Temple or Templelands long after 1312. At Mary Coulter in Aberdeenshire, formerly a Templar preceptory, the site was officially granted to the Hospitallers but continued to be called the Temple in local records for centuries. The same pattern appears at Temple itself in Midlothian, at Blantyre, and at numerous other sites. The persistence of Templar nomenclature suggests continuity of identity beyond the formal dissolution of the order. More revealing is the evidence from architectural modifications. Ground-penetrating radar and excavation have revealed that several former Templar properties underwent significant construction in the early 14th century. New fortifications, expanded chapels, residential quarters built in styles consistent with military orders. If the Hospitallers were truly absorbing empty Templar properties, why the extensive construction? Unless the properties were not empty, but continuing to function under new management, or under the same management with a different name. The documentary silence regarding individual Templars is equally suggestive. In England, records detail the fate of hundreds of Templar knights. Some were imprisoned, others transferred to monasteries, many were granted pensions. In Scotland, fewer than a dozen Templars can be identified by name in records before 1312, and their subsequent fates are almost entirely unrecorded. 2 Scottish Templars were reportedly arrested and questioned after the Suppression, then absolved and sent to Cistercian monasteries in the borders. But the rest? Statistical analysis conducted by modern historians suggests that at least 29 to 48 Templar knights and sergeants were active in Scotland at the time of the Suppression. They do not appear in arrest records, trial proceedings, or pension rolls. The most extraordinary anomaly appears in a charter of King James IV of Scotland, dated 1488, 176 years after the Templars were officially dissolved. The charter bears the Latin title Fretribus Hospitalis Hierosolymitani, Militibus Templi Solomonis, to the Brothers of the Hospital of Jerusalem, Knights of the Temple of Solomon. In this document, The king reaffirmed the ancient rights and privileges not only of the Order of St. John but also of the Templars. This suggests that as late as the 15th century, the Scottish Templars retained some form of legal existence, or at least that their memory was sufficiently alive to warrant royal recognition. Even more revealing is evidence that in Scotland, the two orders may have merged. Several historical documents reference a combined entity called the Order of St. John and the Temple that continued to operate in Scotland until the Reformation in 1560. This represents a solution unique to Scotland. Rather than suppressing the Templars and transferring their properties to a separate rival order, the Scottish authorities appear to have combined the two organizations into a single entity that preserved elements of both. This timeline diverges dramatically from what occurred elsewhere in Europe. The pattern suggests that Robert Bruce, excommunicated and fighting for his kingdom's independence, saw the Templar crisis not as a religious matter requiring obedience to papal authority, but as a political opportunity. His kingdom needed warriors. The Templars were experienced soldiers trained in tactics developed during centuries of warfare in the East. If they sought refuge, Scotland could offer it in exchange for service. When scholars attempt to trace the Scottish Templars through documentary sources between 1307 and 1350, they encounter not merely an absence of information, but evidence of active suppression. The silences in the historical record are not random. They follow a pattern that suggests deliberate editing conducted by multiple hands across multiple generations. Monastic cartularies, registers in which religious houses recorded property transactions, legal agreements, and significant events, display suspicious discontinuities at Scottish abbeys with known Templar connections. At Melrose Abbey, one of the most important Cistercian houses in Scotland, the cartulary shows a sequence of carefully documented transactions and donations from the late 13th century. Then, at precisely the year 1307, the documentation becomes sparse. Entries that should exist, transfers of properties, grants of privileges, appointments of officials are missing. The gap extends to 1320, after which normal record-keeping resumes. At Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh, the pattern repeats with even more obvious signs of interference. Folio pages covering the period 1308 to 1315 have been physically removed from the bound manuscript. The cuts are clean and deliberate, made with a sharp blade. Stub edges remain visible in the binding, showing exactly where parchment once existed. Paleographic analysis indicates that the removal occurred not in the 14th century, when the pages were created, but much later, possibly in the 15th or 16th century, suggesting that successive generations of record keepers felt compelled to conceal information about this specific period. Royal records present similar anomalies. The Scottish Exchequer rolls, which documented crown revenues and expenditures, are notably incomplete for the reign of Robert the Bruce. Sequences of years show no entries for properties that should have been generating income for the crown, including former Templar estates officially transferred to the Hospitallers. Properties at Ballintrodoch, at Marycoulter, at locations throughout southern Scotland should appear in revenue accounts if they were functioning as productive estates. Yet they do not. The implication is either that revenue was collected but not recorded, or recorded in registers that were subsequently destroyed. The absence is particularly striking when compared to English records from the same period. In England, every stage of the Templar property transfer was documented in exhaustive detail. Royal officials compiled inventories of Templar holdings in 1308, immediately after the arrests. These inventories listed every manor, every mill, every church benefice, every source of income down to annual rents from individual tenants. The transfer to the Hospitallers generated further documentation, disputes over specific properties, negotiations over valuations, legal challenges from families claiming hereditary rights to lands their ancestors had donated to the Templars. In Scotland, nothing comparable exists. The absence cannot be explained by general record loss because Scottish royal and ecclesiastical archives preserve extensive documentation from periods immediately before and after 1307, 1320. The gap is specific to records that would illuminate what happened to the Templars and their properties during the suppression. Church registers reveal perhaps the most telling evidence of deliberate suppression. Bishops' registers, which recorded ordinations, ecclesiastical appointments, and disciplinary matters, show gaps in several Scottish dioceses during the crucial period. The register for the Diocese of St. Andrews, which included Templar properties in Fife, is missing entries for 1308-1315. This diocese was governed by Bishop William Lamberton, who had been Guardian of Scotland and was a close ally of Robert Bruce. Some historians have suggested that Lamberton may have provided protection to the Templars, though no direct evidence survives. Paleographic analysis of surviving sections of these registers reveals signs of alteration that go beyond missing pages. Passages have been scraped away using pumice or blade, text has been overwritten, dates have been modified. In one instance, a marginal note in a 13th century hand in the Holyrood cartulary references the Brothers of the Temple at Ballintrodoch, but the passage it annotates has been obliterated. The note survived because it was written in the margin, overlooked by whoever systematically removed references to the Templars from the main text. Modern forensic techniques have made it possible to detect these alterations with precision. Under ultraviolet light, scraped parchment shows different fluorescence patterns than undamaged surfaces. Infrared imaging can sometimes recover text that has been erased but left slight impressions in the parchment fibers. Multispectral imaging has revealed, in several Scottish manuscripts, faint impressions from facing pages that show words no longer present in the original text. Shadows of documents that once existed but were deliberately removed. Who performed this censorship and why? Analysis of the documents themselves reveals that the suppression occurred in multiple phases. Some erasures appear to date from the immediate aftermath of 1312, likely conducted by Scottish ecclesiastical authorities seeking to demonstrate nominal compliance with papal directives while actually protecting the refugees. Other redactions date to the 15th and 16th centuries, when Scotland was seeking diplomatic recognition within the wider European community and could not afford to be seen as a haven for condemned heretics. The Protestant Reformation in 1560 brought its own wave of destruction, as reformers purged monastic libraries of materials they considered idolatrous or superstitious. This final wave of censorship compounded earlier losses, creating gaps within gaps, absences that obscure earlier absences. What remains is a documentary landscape full of shadows, where silences reveal more than words, where the systematic removal of evidence becomes evidence itself. The fragmented nature of Templar records across different regions reveals not a single suppression narrative, but multiple parallel histories that illuminate what official records obscure. When documentary accounts from France, England, and Scotland are mapped against each other, patterns emerge that explain how an order could be simultaneously destroyed in one kingdom while being absorbed and transformed in another. French sources, dominated by inquisitorial proceedings and execution records, portray the Templars as defeated heretics whose order was righteously destroyed. The density of documentation from France is extraordinary. Trial transcripts recording hundreds of individual testimonies, financial inventories from seized commanderies, correspondence between royal officials coordinating the arrests. Modern historians have compiled databases covering the fates of specific individuals, where they were arrested, what charges they faced, whether they confessed under torture, whether they were executed or died in prison. The French records create the impression of total institutional collapse. English chronicles present a different picture. While King Edward II eventually complied with papal demands to arrest the Templars, the proceedings in England were far less brutal than in France. Torture was employed reluctantly and only after papal pressure. Most English Templars were eventually absorbed into other religious orders or granted small pensions. Property transfers, though complicated by disputes, were eventually completed. The English narrative is one of dissolution rather than destruction. The order ceased to exist, but individuals survived, and their assets were redistributed through legal mechanisms. Scottish sources, or rather, the conspicuous absence of Scottish sources, suggests something else entirely. The lack of arrest records, trial proceedings, or execution accounts is not merely gaps in documentation, but indicates that these events simply did not occur. When Robert Bruce refused to enforce papal edicts, he was not making a passive decision to ignore Rome. He was actively choosing an alternative path. The divergence in regional responses becomes clearer when examining the political context of each kingdom. In France, King Philip IV was financially desperate and politically powerful enough to manipulate a weak pope. The destruction of the Templars served his immediate fiscal needs. In England, Edward II faced his own financial pressures. but lacked Philip's ruthlessness and could not completely override his baron's objections. The result was a compromise: formal compliance with papal orders, but minimal persecution of individual knights. In Scotland, the situation was entirely unique. Robert Bruce had been excommunicated for murdering John Comyn in 1306. His excommunication was briefly lifted in 1308, but by 1317, he was excommunicated again by Pope John XXIII for refusing to make peace with England. Scotland as an entire kingdom existed under papal interdict. Cut off from the sacraments, its churches silent, its people denied religious rights. In this context, papal bulls ordering the suppression of the Templars carried no weight. Bruce owed nothing to a pope who had declared him outside the church. More significantly, Bruce needed military expertise. His kingdom was fighting for survival against England. The wars of independence demanded skilled soldiers, experienced commanders, and knowledge of fortification and siege warfare. Precisely the expertise the Templars possessed after 2 centuries of crusading. Absorbing refugee Templars into Scottish military forces was not an act of charity, but strategic necessity. The Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314 provides circumstantial evidence of this absorption. Robert Bruce faced an English army estimated at 15,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. Scottish forces numbered perhaps 7,000 infantry and several hundred light horse. Contemporary accounts describe the battle's climax. As Scottish spear formations pressed forward, a fresh force appeared on the Scottish flank. English chroniclers described them as a host of men whose sudden arrival caused panic among English cavalry. Scottish sources refer to them simply as reserves or camp followers mistaken for reinforcements. Legend, persistent in Scottish tradition, identifies them as Templars, knights wearing white mantles and red crosses, appearing at the decisive moment to turn near defeat into stunning victory. No contemporary chronicle explicitly confirms this identification, but none definitively refutes it either. The identity of the flanking force remains one of the battle's enduring mysteries. If Templars were present, they fought anonymously, their participation unrecorded in official accounts that could not acknowledge their presence without admitting Scotland's defiance of papal authority. What is documented is the aftermath. Robert Bruce rewarded his supporters with lands and titles. Among the beneficiaries were families known to have had connections to the Templar order: the Sinclairs, the Setons, the Stuarts. Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century by William Sinclair, is adorned with carvings that scholars have linked to Templar and Masonic symbolism, suggesting continuity of tradition across generations. The divergent histories converge when viewed not as contradictory, but as complementary perspectives on a complex transformation. French sources document destruction. English sources document dissolution and legal transfer. Scottish sources document, through their very silence, absorption and transformation. Together, they map a process by which an international military order, officially suppressed, continued to exist in fragmented form, destroyed in some regions, driven underground in others, and reconstituted under new identities in places where political circumstances permitted. The suppression of the Knights Templar was not simply about wealth or political power, though both played crucial roles. At a deeper level, it represented a systematic campaign to eliminate an organization that had developed institutional independence incompatible with the consolidating authority of both church and crown. Understanding what happened in Scotland requires understanding what made the Templars dangerous beyond their military might and financial resources. The order's prolonged presence in Jerusalem, with headquarters on the Temple Mount from 1119 to 1187, gave them access to sites and knowledge unavailable to others. Archaeological evidence confirms that the Templars excavated extensively beneath their headquarters. British survey teams in 1867 discovered tunnels beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque that matched medieval descriptions of Templar digging. Whether they discovered ancient manuscripts, sacred relics, or simply gained invaluable knowledge of the region's history remains debated. But when the 9 founding knights returned to Europe after their mysterious first 9 years in Jerusalem, they emerged transformed, from obscure warriors to recipients of extraordinary papal privileges. The Templars maintained extensive archives at their Paris headquarters and regional preceptories. These archives included not merely financial records and correspondence, but ritual texts governing their internal practices, maps of the Holy Land, diplomatic intelligence, and according to some accounts, materials recovered from beneath the Temple Mount. When King Philip IV's men seized the Paris Temple on October 13, 1307, securing these archives was a primary objective. French royal inventories list confiscated documents but also note significant gaps, records that should have existed but were not found. What knowledge justified such thorough suppression? The charges brought against the Templars provide clues, even if the accusations themselves were fabricated. The claim that initiates were told to deny Christ and spit on the cross suggests fears that the order practiced beliefs contrary to Orthodox Christianity. The reference to worshipping an idol called Baphomet, possibly a corruption of Muhammad, hints at suspected Muslim sympathies. The allegations of secret rituals conducted in darkness point to anxieties about knowledge transmitted outside church control. Modern analysis recognizes these confessions as products of torture, yet the accusations themselves reveal what medieval authorities feared, that the Templars had developed alternative traditions, esoteric knowledge, and organizational structures independent of ecclesiastical oversight. The order answered only to the Pope, owned properties across Europe, moved freely across borders, and maintained contact with Muslim rulers and scholars. This level of autonomy was incompatible with the consolidating power of territorial monarchs and a papacy increasingly concerned about heresy. In Scotland, the question of forbidden knowledge takes on different dimensions. If Templar refugees brought archives with them, what happened to those documents? No collection of Templar manuscripts has been discovered in Scotland, yet evidence suggests knowledge transmission occurred. The architectural precision of structures built at former Templar sites in the early 14th century demonstrates specialized expertise. The persistence of specific symbols, geometric patterns, and building orientations across multiple locations indicates coordinated activity following a common template. Rosslyn Chapel, built by the Sinclair family beginning in 1446, exemplifies this transmission. The chapel contains carvings that scholars have linked to Templar, Masonic, and esoteric traditions. The designer clearly had access to architectural knowledge and symbolic vocabularies that should not have been available in 15th century Scotland, unless preserved and transmitted secretly. The chapel functions as encoded text, its carvings a library written in stone for those trained to read it. The geographic distribution of post-suppression Templar symbolism reveals organized preservation of tradition. Sites across southern Scotland display carved stones and architectural elements from the early 14th century onward that employ consistent symbolic vocabularies. This is not random convergence, but evidence of shared knowledge maintained across generations. The pattern suggests that when the Templars were suppressed, their knowledge infrastructure was not destroyed but dispersed, fragmented into local traditions that preserved elements of the whole while avoiding detection. Secret societies operating in Scotland from the 15th century forward claimed descent from Templar traditions. Early Masonic lodges incorporated rituals, symbols, and organizational structures remarkably similar to those attributed to the medieval order. While direct institutional continuity cannot be proven, the persistence of specific practices implies transmission through unofficial channels. The Templars, officially extinct, continued to exist as an idea, a tradition, a body of knowledge passed from initiate to initiate outside ecclesiastical authority. This raises the crucial question, what made this knowledge worth preserving at such risk? The answer may lie not in specific secrets, though those certainly existed, but in the principle the knowledge represented. The Templars had demonstrated that religious authority and secular power were not the only possible organizing principles for society. They had created an international organization operating across borders, combining military discipline with financial sophistication, answerable to no king and protected by papal privilege. They represented an alternative model of how human institutions could function. When that model was destroyed, the idea survived. In Scotland, where royal authority was weak enough and papal authority non-existent, the conditions existed for that idea to be preserved. Not as a functioning military order, that was impossible, but as a tradition embedded in architecture, ritual, and organizational memory. The conspiracy was not that the Templars were heretics. It was that they represented an alternative locus of knowledge and authority that threatened the monopoly both church and crown sought to establish. The survival of Templar traditions in Scotland required transformation. Men who had worn white mantles emblazoned with red crosses could no longer do so without inviting persecution, even in a kingdom beyond immediate papal reach. The process by which these warrior monks became something else left traces in the landscape and material culture that modern archaeology is only now fully mapping. The geographic distribution of suspected Templar absorption sites reveals a network aligned with Scotland's power centers and defensive requirements. Robert Bruce's power base lay in southwestern Scotland, Carrick, Annandale, Galloway, regions where Templar properties had existed before 1307. Templar holdings at Temple in Midlothian, at Maryculter in Aberdeenshire, and at multiple sites in the borders positioned them along primary invasion routes from England. If Bruce absorbed Templar refugees into his military forces, these locations would have been strategic positions for experienced soldiers. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Fortifications at former Templar sites show enhancement in the early 14th century using construction techniques documented at Templar castles in the Crusader states. At Maryculter, excavations revealed modifications to defensive walls employing masonry styles characteristic of military religious orders. The work was not mere repair but sophisticated upgrading, requiring specialized engineering knowledge possessed by men trained in the architectural traditions of the military orders. Maritime connections provide another thread of evidence. The Templars had maintained a fleet based at La Rochelle in France, and records indicate ships disappeared from that port in the weeks before the October 1307 arrests. Scotland's west coast, particularly Argyll and the islands, offered harbors accessible to vessels crossing from France. Kilmartin, with its collection of enigmatic grave slabs bearing anonymous swords, lies in a region dominated by maritime culture, where Norse, Irish, and Scottish influences overlapped. The carved stones at Kilmartin include maritime symbols alongside military imagery, suggesting a population connected to seaborne networks. If Templar ships reached Scotland's western approaches, this is precisely where they would have made landfall. The region's political fragmentation at the time, claimed by Scotland but partially independent under local lords, would have made it ideal for refugees seeking to avoid official scrutiny. Trade routes and monastic networks facilitated the diffusion of Templar traditions across subsequent generations. Scottish monasteries maintained connections with continental houses, exchanging not only correspondence but also monks, manuscripts, and material culture. Several Scottish abbeys were affiliated with Cistercian or Augustinian orders that had maintained close relationships with the Templars before the Suppression. When Templar refugees entered religious life under different identities, they brought architectural knowledge, manuscript illumination techniques, and symbolic vocabularies they had developed. This explains the appearance of distinctively Templar motifs in churches and monasteries built decades after the order's official dissolution. The 15th century saw the emergence of institutions explicitly claiming Templar heritage. Rosslyn Chapel remains the most famous example. Built beginning in 1446 by William Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, the chapel's elaborate carvings include symbols scholars have linked to Templar traditions, Masonic emblems, and esoteric Christianity. The Sinclair family had documented connections to the Templars before 1307, and oral traditions claim they sheltered Templar refugees. Whether this represents authentic transmission or Renaissance-era romanticism about a legendary order remains debated. But the chapel demonstrates that by the mid-15th century, Templar identity had become something worth claiming. Freemasonry's emergence in Scotland provides another vector for tradition survival. The earliest documented Masonic lodges appeared in Scotland in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, though Masonic historians argue their traditions are older. Several Scottish lodges claimed Templar descent, and rituals incorporated narratives about the order's suppression and secret survival. While direct institutional continuity from Templars to Freemasons cannot be proven, the symbolic overlap is striking. Both organizations used architectural metaphors, emphasized moral instruction through allegorical ritual, maintained hierarchical degrees of initiation, and employed similar symbolic vocabularies. If Templar knowledge survived in Scotland, craft guilds and proto-Masonic organizations would have been logical repositories. These groups operated semi-publicly, but maintained internal traditions kept from outsiders. They provided mechanisms for preserving specialized knowledge across generations, while avoiding the scrutiny that would have fallen on any explicitly religious or military organization. The Phantom Knights, transformed from military religious order to dispersed initiatory tradition, would have spread through exactly such channels. The pattern of survival mirrors natural evolutionary processes. When an organism cannot survive in its current form, it does not vanish completely. It adapts, fragments, evolves into new forms better suited to prevailing conditions. Similarly, the knowledge deemed too dangerous in the 13th century did not disappear but transformed, emerging in more acceptable forms across subsequent centuries. Gothic architecture's sudden mathematical precision, the Renaissance rediscovery of classical knowledge, the scientific revolution's astronomical breakthroughs, each might represent carefully timed re-emergence of suppressed understanding rather than spontaneous discovery. The breakthrough in understanding the Scottish Templar phenomenon came not from a single dramatic discovery, but from the cumulative weight of evidence assembled through interdisciplinary collaboration. For centuries, scattered references to Templars in Scottish legends, architectural anomalies at sites like Rosslyn Chapel, and enigmatic grave slabs at Kilmartin were treated as isolated curiosities. The turning point came when researchers began applying forensic archaeology, statistical analysis, and comparative symbolism to interrogate the gaps in the historical record as rigorously as the documents themselves. Statistical analysis proved particularly revelatory. By compiling comprehensive databases of Templar personnel documented in French, English, and Scottish records before 1307, researchers identified a significant demographic anomaly. At least 335 Templars who should have been captured in the initial French arrests are unaccounted for in subsequent records. They did not appear in trials, were not pensioned off, did not transfer to the Hospitallers, and left no death records. Statistical modeling of escape routes identified Scotland as one of the most probable destinations. Further analysis suggested that incorporating 29 to 48 experienced Templar Knights into Scottish forces would have been strategically significant, precisely the scale that archaeological and architectural evidence supports. Archaeological excavation provided physical corroboration. At Temple in Midlothian, ground-penetrating radar surveys revealed building foundations beneath the existing church that predate documented Hospitaller occupation, but postdate the original Templar preceptory. Radiocarbon dating returned dates between 1310 and 1340, precisely when official records claim no Templar activity occurred. The architectural layout matches design principles documented at Templar commanderies in France and the Holy Land, including specific orientations and defensive features. These were not local builders copying generic designs, but professionals applying specialized Templar knowledge decades after the order was extinct. Linguistic and symbolic evidence provided the final piece. Paleographers examining carved stones identified letter forms and symbolic elements traceable to Templar contexts. The swords incised on anonymous graves match weapons documented in Templar inventories. Some stones display partially effaced inscriptions. Advanced imaging revealed traces of letters beneath surface weathering and deliberate obliteration. Reconstructed fragments include phrases in Latin using formulae documented in Templar liturgical texts. The inscriptions were not worn away by time, but deliberately damaged, yet not completely destroyed, as if those doing the damage were conflicted about fully erasing the memory. Cross-referencing architectural, archaeological, and symbolic data created a map of Templar influence far more extensive than previously understood. Sites across southern and eastern Scotland show evidence of post-1307 activity by individuals with Templar training. The pattern is strategic, concentrated along defensible positions, near royal strongholds, at locations crucial for Robert Bruce's military campaigns. The revelation is not merely that Templars reached Scotland, but that they were systematically integrated into Scotland's military infrastructure over decades. The final confirmation came from comparative analysis with Iberian parallels. In Portugal, the Templars were reconstituted as the Order of Christ in 1319. In Aragon, they merged with the Order of Montesa. These transitions were documented because they occurred with official sanction. In Scotland, no such documentation exists because the process was extra-legal. Bruce was excommunicated and had no interest in seeking papal approval. The outcome was functionally identical. Templar expertise and tradition survived by absorption into new frameworks. The difference is that in Scotland, this happened invisibly. Yet significant obstacles remain. Government heritage agencies face tensions between scholarly inquiry and public expectations. Historic Environment Scotland manages sites attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors drawn by Templar theories. Excavation permits for sites with suspected associations have sometimes been denied, ostensibly to protect fragile resources, though researchers question whether the real concern is protecting established interpretations. Access to archives remains contentious. While the Vatican published trial records in 2007, many archives throughout Europe still hold Templar-related materials never fully catalogued. The Vatican Apostolic Archives require special permission for certain collections. Researchers report varying experiences depending on institutional affiliations and specific materials sought. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where the order maintained headquarters for nearly 70 years, remains among the most contested religious sites on Earth. Excavations are politically fraught, and tunnels where British archaeologists discovered Templar artifacts in 1867 remain largely inaccessible. In Scotland, Rosslyn Chapel has become both tourist attraction and source of scholarly frustration. Ground-penetrating radar has identified voids beneath the chapel that may represent additional chambers. Excavation has been prohibited, leaving questions unresolved. At Temple in Midlothian, similar restrictions apply. The question of what lies beneath these sites remains open precisely because investigation is restricted. What can be concluded with reasonable confidence? Documentary evidence strongly supports the view that papal bulls ordering the transfer of Scottish Templar properties to the Hospitallers in 1312 were never fully implemented. Robert Bruce's excommunication and Scotland's independence war created conditions where papal authority was meaningless. The absence of arrest records, trial proceedings, and execution accounts indicates these events did not occur in Scotland as they did elsewhere. The architectural, archaeological, and symbolic evidence demonstrates that individuals with Templar training remained active in Scotland for decades after 1312, contributing to military fortifications, ecclesiastical architecture, and the transmission of specialized knowledge. The properties that should have been transferred to the Hospitallers appear instead to have been dispersed through multiple channels, some nominally conveyed to Hospitaller administration, but effectively controlled by Scottish nobles allied with Bruce. Others absorbed directly into royal estates. Still others maintained as functioning communities under different identities. The evidence suggests not a simple transfer of assets, but a complex transformation in which the Templar Order as an institution ceased to exist, while its personnel, expertise, and traditions were absorbed into Scottish society. The mystery endures not because evidence is absent, but because the evidence that exists contradicts the official narrative so fundamentally that institutions with interests in maintaining that narrative continue to restrict access to sites and archives where definitive answers might be found. The Scottish Templar phenomenon represents one of the most successful examples in medieval history of an organization surviving suppression by transforming itself beyond recognition while preserving its essential knowledge and traditions. What the Hospitallers received in 1312 was not the substance of the Scottish Templar Order, but its shadow, a legal fiction of property transfer that obscured the reality of institutional absorption and transformation occurring beneath the surface of recorded history.